Well, hello and welcome to another chapter of Doctor in Wonderland, The Adventures of a Clinical Psychologist in the Family Courts. So when last we left our intrepid clinical psychologist, I had fallen down the rabbit hole and had organized my understanding of what's happening down here, and that the um, very interesting things that we had the parental alienation experts who were keeping everybody locked up in conflict with their made up pathology label. There's a reason we don't make up pathology, and the PAS experts are a classic example of why. They just diverted everybody into 40 years of fighting and degraded the quality of mental health services in the family courts. That's why we don't do that. And then, but where are the forensic psychologists? Where are my psychologists? Okay, because the PAS people are a ragtag bunch of degrees, psychiatrists and master's level, and even a couple of attorneys back at the time were experts, self-proclaimed experts in this new made-up pathology. And anytime somebody has to make up a new pathology in order to be an expert, they're not really an expert. They're not an expert in attachment or family systems or delusional thought disorders or experts in anything except something they can make up. So that's one side, but at least they recognize the pathology and parents were seeing them as an ally. But it's exploitative to propose that you're discovering some new form of pathology and then manipulate the parents into promoting your new form of pathology, meanwhile withholding the DSM-5 diagnosis. Shared psychotic disorder was in the DSM-4 at the time, and Bill Burnett, who's leading the PAS people, is a psychiatrist. So when I told him it's a shared delusion, and he still doesn't go for it. I mean, he's just still withholding DSM-5 diagnoses and knowledge from the public because he wants to promote parental alienation, and that's just problematic. So there's your allies on one side. But where are my psychologists? I look over at the forensic psychologists, and oh my goodness, they're doing the same thing. They're making up this new experimental role, this quasi-judicial role where they're assisting the court in making custody decisions, and have left healthcare, have left diagnosis and treatment for this new made-up role. And they've made up a new assessment procedure called a custody evaluation for their new made-up role. Their custody evaluation does not diagnose or treat. It's like, oh my goodness. So they're simply financially exploiting. So they make up this new evaluation procedure that costs $20,000 to $40,000. Now, in clinical psychology, the most expensive assessment for the most complicated, autism type of complex trauma pathology would be $5,000, maybe $10,000, not $20,000, $40,000, certainly not 6 to 9 months. In clinical psychology, if you're over 8 weeks on your assessment, it's considered out of date. So I've supervised interns. No, I want your report within 6 to 8 weeks of when you do the assessment. So boom, you get the referral, you do the assessment, 6 to 8 weeks. I want to see your report come back. Weeks, not months. And this is possible child abuse, and they're taking 6 to 9 months. Oh my goodness. So everybody's fighting about this parental alienation. So what am I going to do about this? Well, first off, I have duty to protect obligations. Okay, so this is child abuse, and this is spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. I come out of foster care. I come out of child abuse world. I know what child abuse is. I know what the borderline is. I know what the narcissist is. I know what's going on, regulatory objects and all that sort of stuff. I recognize delusional thought disorder, factitious attachment pathology. So we got child abuse and spousal abuse, creating a shared delusional disorder that destroys a child's attachment. And I have duty to protect. So at this back, I stayed because I got duty to protect obligations to both my clients, but also the general public. And it's my psychologists who are the abusers. Because normally for a child abuse, I just refer the person into their local area mental health people. But it's the mental health people who are the abusers. They believe the shared delusion and so become part of the shared delusion. So I can't protect the children by referral or directly because the forensic psychologists are the child abusers. That's so bad. And if you have to explain the pathology to the doctor, they're not competent by demonstrated need to have it explained to them. So we got absolute zero competence over here. And I know because I have early childhood, which is attachment, and I have 12 years of delusional thought disorders. And so I know what they should know and don't. And I can see that they don't know it in what they're talking about and doing. And so they're just ignorant and incompetent. Google ignorant, lack of knowledge or information. So what am I going to do about that? Well, I have standard 1.04 and 1.05 obligations too out of the APA Ethics Code when I believe there may have been an ethical violation by another psychologist. Yes, standard 2.04 and 2.01. So I got 2 and 3.04 avoiding harm, 9.01 bases for assessment, and principle D, justice, equal access and equal quality. So I've got 4 ethical violations and a violation of a very principle of ethics, justice, equal quality, and equal access. So my standard 1.04 obligations are active to informally notify all the forensic psychologists in all their positions of power and authority that they're in violation, or that I'm concerned they're in violation of multiple ethical standards and their failure and duty to protect. And they're incompetent and they're ignorant, and so I kind of know who they are. So they're going to discount me and swap me away. That's not going to be any good. So then I have 1.05 obligations to take further action appropriate to the situation. So everything that I have been doing in the family court since 2010 has been pursuant to my duty to protect obligations and my ethical obligations under 1.04 and 1.05. And so as soon as everybody understands that, you'll be able to understand the entire body of my work over the course of time. First thing I did was get up on YouTube out of my Pasadena office and filmed up all these videos that informed the public about what the pathology is. So that was step 1, is to educate the public to be informed consumers about the pathology so that they can then obtain competent mental health services to protect their child. So I am empowering the parents to be able to protect their child and hold the forensic psychologists accountable for their ignorance, incompetence, and negligent misdiagnosis. So I have to educate the public. So I started educating about the delusional thought disorder, and I had a choice. We have a delusional thought disorder. We have a factitious disorder imposed on another. Both of those in the DSM-4 are Axis 1 diagnoses. There's also an obsessive compulsive component to this. So I considered adding that constellation, the obsessive compulsive component, because the pathological parent is using the child as a regulatory object. So if you try to interrupt that and take the child away, they become very anxious and very dysregulated. And when there's a trauma replication, a trauma reenactment narrative, the trauma replicates patterns with minor adjustments. So a kid who's playing out like domestic violence in home or something is going to play out the violence situations in doll play in a dollhouse or something, but they're going to make changes to the narrative and the story that serve to work through the emotional experiences for the child. So those changes to the trauma replication are really important from a treatment perspective. And so with this pathology, there are 2 critical changes to the trauma reenactment. The first is in the original child abuse of the allied parent as a child, there was no one who came to protect them. And that's a classic on child abuse. No one knows, no one comes, there's no protection, no rescue. And so in the corrective change on the replication is that the child now has a protective parent in the role of the allied parent. And that helps the allied parent work through their own trauma history, through the child, through what's called projective identification with the child. It's the child who's being abused, and I'm the protected parent. So that's a critical change. And if you try to change that, that's where they become very obsessive. They must be the protected parent. And if you try to take the child away and say, no, that's not true, you see that obsessive compulsive symptom. The other corrective change is that in the previous situation of abuse, the child, the allied parent as a child, was disempowered. So they were a vulnerable child to a powerful parent. Now, for the correction, the child is now empowered to reject the supposedly abusive parent. So that too, that second corrective change becomes obsessive. They must do that. And so the way you see the obsessive compulsive is you just try to change either one of those features, and the obsessive compulsive features will just jump forward. But I thought that was a little too much to go into to educate people. I have to educate the doctors too, but I'm going to educate the doctors through the parents, because the doctors are not motivated. They're ignorant, unethical, and lazy. Just lazy. And so I know the quality of the forensic psychologists right off the bat. Ignorant, incompetent, lazy. Oh my goodness, that's really bad. You got the lowest form of psychologists. I know why, because it's dangerous to work in the family courts. Clinical psychologists don't work here. We abandoned you and gave them. And so I've worked it all out. I understand what's going on. And I thought the factitious disorder, though, was also too unusual for initial entry into people's acceptance. The factitious disorder, but it's a factitious attachment pathology. And to diagnose a factitious disorder, you'd have to know attachment as well. So I said, I'm not going to lead with that. I'm going to lead with the persecutory thought disorder, because that's relatively straightforward in its assessment. It's a mental status exam of thought and perception. No one knows how to do that. That's what I learned 12 years at UCLA, was how to do that and assess for delusional thought disorders. When you diagnose a delusion, you don't do that based on history or report. You pop it out in the session. And that's a mental status exam of thought and perception. It's very linear, and you're looking at the linear logical reasoning of the person's frontal lobe executive function systems. And what you'll find if you do a linear line of questions is you will find a point where it goes sideways. That's called associational thinking. You'll hit the trauma point, and it'll activate emotions, and the emotions will derail the logical thinking over into associational thinking. The two ideas are associated because of the linking emotion. But then what you do is you bring that back in. You don't let it do that. You bring it back into the linear path, and that's going to start to stress their coping, and you stay on it, and then you will get the denial, and ultimately you can take it all the way down to a mild dissociative state. Typically, you don't need to do that. You get the contradictions, then you get the denial, and it becomes pretty obvious what's going on. It's delusional disorder, and there's not linear thinking. So the diagnosis of a thought disorder is not based on what the content of the thought is. It's how the person reached that belief, and whether it's a fixed belief or whether there's some doubt to it or what. And so you're looking at the thought process on that. But it's sophisticated. It takes some training. It takes some stuff to do. So, but I know you can diagnose a delusional thought disorder right in the session, mental status exam, and it's pretty straightforward. And the borderline's collapsing into the delusional thought disorder. The narcissist is collapsing into the persecutory delusion. So that's the one I led with, and then the attachment. So then about 2012-ish, I'm meeting with Bill Burnett and your supposed PAS allies, hoping to get them on board with this so that we can come together and provide a grounded DSM-5 diagnosis to then approach into the forensic psychologists and get a change in what they're doing, their custody evaluations. But Bill Burnett would simply not do that. And you can see 20 years, a fixed and false belief maintained despite contrary evidence. He just wants to be an expert in parental alienation, and he's willing to sacrifice all the families involved. And I had a lot of problems with that over the years. So starting 2012, I was emailing him. I was part of his PAS group. Then back, I think I met twice so far with Dorsey, once back in Boston when we were all presenting back at the AFCC. Bill and I and Dorsey had a meeting, and I'm trying to get him to cooperate. And then we met again when we were over in Venice with Dorsey and the parent advocate. And I'm trying to get him to cooperate. And I was saying, I offered Bill Burnett, I offered him in Venice, and Dorsey will back this up. She was at the table. Another parent advocate was at the table. I hosted a dinner with our family, so my wife was there, and Dorsey and Bill and his wife and parent advocate. And I offered to Bill, I said, we need to shut down parental alienation because we need to ground this in real knowledge. And there's no treatment for that or anything. It's a shared delusion, and we need to ground in established knowledge and end the fighting. So, but I would be willing, I recommend, or I offered to write a joint article, 2 joint articles with Bill. The first one would be on the construct of parental alienation, where he would take the first part of the article, describe its history, describe anything he wants about Gardner and anything. And then he would pass it on to me for the second half of the article, where I would say, well, that was really a nice start on understanding the pathology. And as it's been uncovered, we're moving into a shared delusion, factitious disorder, attachment, pathology, grounding in here. So that would be a nice article to unite the field and go up against the forensic custody evaluators and their quasi-judicial role. He said, and the second article would be one about the DSM-6 or whatever, the next versions of the DSM, where I would recommend, with the DSM-5, they took out the shared delusion, the shared psychotic disorder, they put it in delusional disorder. I would recommend we go back to that, the shared psychotic disorder, reintroduce it, change the name to shared delusional disorder, and locate it in the trauma section. It's a trauma-based shared delusion, transgenerational trauma. And so we should have a shared delusional disorder, persecutory delusion over in the trauma section, not the psychotic section. And that gives the trauma people a whole new diagnosis, transgenerational trauma. They'd love that, I think. And the diagnosis was in the DSM-4. It was a shared psychotic disorder. So I'm meeting with Bill, I think it was 2016 in Venice with Dorsey, and I proposed these 2 articles. And he said, no. I said, okay. His requirement was that I accept the validity of parental alienation syndrome. No, that's a done deal. We have to kill it in order to get competence and hold people accountable. In order to activate standard 2.01 for competence and 2.04 for basis for knowledge, we have to apply established knowledge. If we're just making stuff up, we can't hold them accountable for these ethical issues and for competence. Competence in what? Parental alienation? There's no such thing. Competence in attachment, competence in family system, competence in delusional thought disorders. We can hold them accountable. He just would not do that. He insists that the only solution is parental alienation. So then I said to Bill, I said, okay, how about this? Just give me this. Release the parental alienation study group to be an advocacy group. Okay, help advocate for change, for competence. He said no. This is his words. He said, the parental alienation study group is not an advocacy group. It is only to study the pathology. There's no working with him. And he is going to continue to present medical psychiatric misinformation to the general public to mislead them into this awful diagnosis that they have to prove to a judge, rather than tell them what the actual pathology in the DSM-5 is: shared delusion, factitious disorder imposed on another, and child psychological abuse. And they don't know that. Um, so this whole Bill episode, so I met with him in 2012, and he was putting on the full court press on the AFCC, in the American Psychiatric Association. The DSM-5 was coming out, and he was trying to get parental alienation in the DSM-5 somehow by reference or something. I just sat back and let him do what he was going to do. I didn't bother trying to undermine him or anything. Give him his full head. APA came back with nothing. Nope, they didn't endorse parental alienation in any way, shape, manner, or form. And they took out the shared delusional disorder, they buried it into delusional disorders, took it out as a separate diagnosis because they don't like shared diagnoses. And they did add child psychological abuse. In the DSM-4, it was only physical, sexual, and neglect. DSM-5 added psychological abuse. And I said, ooh, that's great. That's exactly the diagnosis I need. But you guys haven't thought this through well, because how do you define what psychological child abuse is? Well, I'm going to define it as creating a shared delusional disorder and a factitious disorder imposed on another, two like major psychiatric disorders. That's clearly child psychological abuse. So everybody else define it however you want, but I got a really clear diagnosis that's anchored in the DSM. That's great. So let's do that. And that's where Bill is saying, nope. And you can look, and if you look at Bill's writings, he's never talking about the child abuse diagnosis, because that's Dr. Childress on his attachment-based parental alienation, on his DSM-5 base. What he talks about is parent-child relationship problems, the softer. He's intentionally withholding the child psychological abuse diagnosis from parents. Him and Gottlieb and Lorandos and all the PAS experts, Woodall and everything, and they know it. I've told them over the years, and you can go back in my blogs because I'm documenting it on my blogs at that point. So then I was hoping to get access to their American Journal of Family Therapy so I could start publishing, to then take those publications and move it into the forensic world and start challenging the forensic psychologists. But I submitted an article, okay, and I was in negotiation with some of the editors, Sauber and others. I said, like, submitting an article, and I would recommend 4 articles from Dr. Childress, one on assessment and diagnosis, one on treatment, one on the legal system, and I figure out what the 4th one was: assessment, diagnosis, legal system, and treatment, something like that. So you could put it in one journal issue and then add some discussants at the end, or you can spread them off across 4 and add discussants at the end. But that's what I would recommend. They said, no, we want it in one article. So all of what I wrote in Foundations, so this entire book, they want in a 20-page article about assessment, diagnosis, and treatment and the failed legal system. So I gave them an article. It's about 25 pages, and it has references on it. And so I submitted that in 2013. And that, I'm trying to organize all. It's complex. You got family systems, you got delusional thought disorders, and you got meaning constructions, and you got all this other stuff. And I'm still trying to organize it into a way to describe it to everybody. And attachment and all this stuff. So I got it down to 25 pages. I got that. It was rejected because, and here's the feedback. The article was rejected because I didn't pay sufficient homage to Gardner and PAS. I didn't discuss Gardner PAS at all. I didn't discuss parental alienation. I didn't use the word. I didn't discuss Gardner or nothing. And that was a problem. I didn't pay proper homage to Gardner. Well, you're inserting Gardner. I'm not talking about Gardner. I'm not talking, but they want me to be talking about that. Because, remember I said obsessive compulsive? It's got an obsessive compulsive feature. They are obsessed with that. They are discovering a new pathology unique to the family courts, that you need a whole unique new set of symptoms that they are simply making up. Grandiose, entitled, obsessive. It's like, my goodness. And these are the professionals. So they rejected the article. Interesting. One reviewer, I don't know who, I suspect Bill, said that it was so dense, the concept, that it made his brain hurt reading it. And that made me laugh. It made my brain hurt. Well, of course, I put this entire book into 20 pages. Of course it was dense. Be at your request. But then I put that up, the article up on my website, archival website. Interestingly, the reason I'm going into this story is interestingly, that's the article that Walters and Friedlander found. And so in their family court review article where they talk about delusional thought disorders, they cite to Childress 2013, which is the article I submitted to Bill Burnett and the AFCC, or I mean the American Journal of Family Therapy and the PAS experts, and was turned down. And so I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. So, so I get over here. I'm trying to work with your PAS allies and realize they're not going to do that. And then I got back channel information that the PAS experts had a phone meeting and had talked about how are they going to handle Dr. Childress. And their solution was to completely ignore me, to shut me out. They'll show me. If I'm not going to accept their parental alienation, they're going to give me no oxygen. They're not going to talk about me in any of their discussions, in any of their articles, nothing. And they will not publish any article from Dr. Childress into their journal, where they're editors. So they shut me out of the journal and they won't talk about me. Now, what the pathogen is doing, because it can't talk about me, the pathogen, it has to avoid me. I'm like an antiviral agent, and if you put it in a petri dish, all the bacteria kind of stays away from it. That's what it has to do. Because if the pathology encounters me and has to deal with the information, I'm going to solve it. I'm going to point it out. And everything I'm saying is true and correct. So the only solution it has is to completely avoid me. Dorsey would crack up. It's like I'm Lord Voldemort, the psychologist who cannot be named, and so he who cannot be named. Now, if I challenge that with them and that low level of professionalism, oh my goodness, somebody comes up and tells you the solution and the diagnosis, and you're going to just stonewall it and not acknowledge the accomplishment of having diagnosed a full diagnostic treatise, and you're not even going to acknowledge it. That's just way substantially below anything I have ever worked with, any professional. So that's just like bottom feeding kind of professional to do that. But now if I challenge that, their response is, oh, you're trying to make this all about you. So I had to endure the disrespect, and I could not challenge them on it. I just said, okay. Knowing that we're losing hundreds, if not thousands, of families every year to the pathology, year after year after year, because they don't have the child abuse diagnosis, they don't have the diagnosis, and they don't know, and they're getting misled into parental alienation and destruction in the family courts. You have to prove parental alienation to a judge in the family courts. You don't have to prove a shared delusion. You get a diagnosis of that. Much cheaper than you take the diagnosis of child abuse back to the family courts. But they're forcing parents to go into the family courts to prove to a judge an impossibly weak pathology, parental alienation, where it has so many holes in it, rather than give them a DSM-5 diagnosis and that can take child abuse to the court. Just immensely moral problems in the PAS people, not ethical problems, yes, competence problems, yes, variety of ethical issues, moral problems I have with them. And you can go back and look. In 2017, I put up a whole bunch of blogs say, tell me the solution using parental alienation. Tell us the solution. If you're going to propose parental alienation, tell us the steps by which that's going to solve anything, because it's not. Nothing. Silence. They will not answer a single question or a single challenge. So I had to put them aside. Now, one of the implications of that, though, has been the forensic psychologists have had no early warning on my coming. So I've been silent, moving through the family court system, doing what I'm doing, and there's no articles for me. There's nothing out there, which is kind of fine for me, because I'm going after the license of the forensic psychologist. So the closer I get before they see I'm right there, the less chance they'll have to escape accountability for what they did. So I'm just doing my work over the years, setting up myself for the future that's coming rather than the present that is. But what I'm going to wrap up here with now is that when I got over here, one of the first things I did was grab control of the language. That's coming out of narrative psychology. So you think Lewis Carroll and all the language kind of wordplay kind of stuff going on with that. Well, yeah, this pathology uses manipulative language, immensely manipulative language. So manipulative. And there was two in particular that I switched around, three. One is the parental alienation. I switched it to pathogenic parenting because parental alienation looks at the parent doing, this bad thing. Pathogenic is creating pathology in the child. Pathopathology, genesis, creation. So it's parenting practices that are so distorted that they're creating pathology in the child. So that is anchored in the child's symptoms. So I can, based on the child's symptoms, I can tell it's pathogenic parenting producing those symptoms. And the word pathogenic comes out of the attachment system and attachment literature. It's used all over in attachment because the only cause of attachment pathology is pathogenic parenting. It's not like ADHD. Attachment just doesn't suddenly go haywire. It goes haywire because it's getting bad parenting. So bad parenting is causing the attachment pathology. It's pathogenic parenting causing. So it's used all over there. And this is attachment pathology. So I was grounding again, and that would allow us to diagnose the pathology just based on the child's symptoms and context. I wouldn't have to necessarily diagnose the shared delusion in the parent. As long as I get the pathogenic parenting, the parent's doing the child psychological abuse. So I switched that term around. The other manipulative term when I got here was they would talk about the allied parent as the favored parent. Oh, so one parent is the favored parent of the child. Now we're going to, and they would sue this one too, rip the child away from the favored parent. They were controlling the narrative. So I switched the favored parent over to the allied parent and targeted parent. Now I thought about various other neutral terms, alpha parent, delta parent, those sorts of things. And I think those ultimately would be better because we're dealing with transgenerational trauma to create individual levels. And that's not pejorative. But allied and targeted are consistent with the family systems. One parent's allied in the cross-generational coalition, the other's a target of spousal abuse, using the child as a weapon. So I use those two terms, allied parent and targeted parent, because those were more neutral to get the favored parent out. Now, if you hear somebody use the term the favored parent or the preferred parent, that person is pathological. Okay, they have the pathology, the unresolved trauma in their brain, and they are presenting a false narrative that they've got their finger on the bias and the whole thing because they see they're a problem. I call those tells. Like in poker, if you make a twitch every time you get a good hand, and people say, and you don't know it, everybody, that's a tell about your hand is your twitch. Or in archaeology, these mounds, these hills where cities used to be, that's a tell of what's underneath. And so the use of favored parent or preferred parent is a tell on the pathology in that person. That person is pathogenic by using that. So I switched that. And then the other one was the narrative that they had was, you're ripping the child away. And they would say, ripping the child away from this favored parent. You can see that in Caden's Law now. You're ripping the child away from this bonded, loving, and the whole storyline of the borderline mom. And so I changed that separation to protective separation. I added the word protective. And boy, that just took off. Dorsey loved to grab these words and changes and just ran with them because she saw the value in them. but the protective separation, that because the narrative that the pathological parent was presenting is that they are the protective parent. You know, that trauma reenactment narrative, I'm the protective parent. I'm going to challenge for that. No, no, no. I'm the protective psychologist, and the targeted parent is the protective parent, and you're the abusive parent. I'm changing the whole narrative structure of this whole thing. And so we are protectively separating the child from an abusive parent. And so we're going to challenge on that narrative. So I changed those three components of the language to remove some of the bias that's over here. And then I started to do other things with the language. So with that, as I came out, that's 2012, 2015, 16 zone and realm. So then I'll talk next time about going to the AFCC, and then the petition to the APA, and then, you know, writing the booklets and stuff and coming up, and that whole period of time, publishing foundations and sort of getting a ground on the situation. So going to the Mad Hatter's Tea Party next. Oh boy. Leaving the hookah smoking caterpillars of PAS and getting over to the Tea Party of the actual family courts. So with that, take care and check in with you next week about the adventures of a clinical psychologist in the family courts. Take care. Bye-bye.